You boys ever hear a rifle tell the truth? The question drifted across the firing line in a voice so calm it almost vanished in the desert wind. Yet somehow it cut sharper than Gunnery Sergeant Logan Briggs's barked commands. The range at Camp Pendleton had been locked in frustration since dawn. 17 missed attempts. 17 steel targets untouched at 1,100 yards, shimmering beyond the heat waves rolling off the sandstone ridge. Wind flags snapped in 3 directions at once, lying to every ballistic computer strapped to young wrists. Marines muttered over data cards, scopes clicked, spotters argued corrections, and still the target remained untouched, mocking them from the far ridge. Then the old man spoke. No one had noticed exactly when he walked up behind the line. One moment the range was all boots and gravel, burnt powder scent, and irritated young pride, and the next there stood an old Marine in faded denim, worn field jacket, and sun-weathered hands resting lightly on a long cloth-wrapped object. His hair was silver, his posture unhurried. His pale blue eyes fixed not on the shooters but on the distant canyon as though reading something written in the moving air. Briggs turned slowly, irritation sharpening his jaw. This is a restricted sniper range, old-timer. A few younger Marines smirked. Someone whispered groundskeeper. Someone else laughed. The old man did not answer right away. He watched a range flag twitch left while dust along the ravine drifted right. Then he said, "You're solving one wind. Bullet flies through 3. Silence lingered for half a second before Briggs let out a short laugh. "And I suppose you learned that with that museum piece?" He pointed toward the cloth-wrapped rifle. The old man unwrapped it with the care of a man opening memory itself. Walnut stock dark with age. Steel worn smooth from decades of hands. A fixed scope old enough to belong in a museum, and near the bolt, a deep scar gouged into the wood. The M40 drew murmurs from the line. Even the youngest Marines recognized the legend. But recognition quickly gave way to ridicule. "That thing won't hold 0. Looks like it fought the Civil War. Probably kicks harder than it shoots." Briggs stepped closer, grinning now, feeding on the laughter. "Tell me, old man, you planning to teach Force Recon how sniping worked in black and white?" The old veteran looked at him the way weathered mountains might regard a storm too young to understand winter. "Just saying your target isn't where you think it is." Briggs folded his arms. Pride had already curdled into challenge. "Fine. Since you know so much, I'll make you a bet." Heads turned. Spotters lowered binoculars. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Briggs pointed toward the steel silhouette glinting far beyond the mirage. "One shot. You hit that target first try. This whole line listens to every word you say. You miss?" He paused, smile widening. "You carry brass till sunset." Laughter rolled again, rough and easy. But not everyone laughed. Lance Corporal Ethan Cole watched the old man's face and felt a knot tighten in his gut. There was no offense there, no embarrassment, only the strange, unsettling calm of someone who had waded through worse than mockery. The old man stepped toward the firing line, fingers brushing the scar in the rifle stock as though greeting an old ghost. Heat shimmer danced over the valley. Somewhere a hawk circled high above the ridge. And for reasons none of them could explain, every Marine on that range suddenly stopped talking. Dean Mercer did not shoulder the rifle right away. He stood at the firing line as if listening to something none of them could hear, the old M40 resting in his hands with the quiet familiarity of a man greeting an old companion. Gunnery Sergeant Briggs watched with folded arms, wearing the half-smile of someone convinced he had already won. Around them, Marines shifted in the gravel, boots scraping, optics glinting in the California sun. Beyond the line, heat shimmer rose in wavering ribbons over the canyon floor, bending distance into illusion. Dean narrowed his eyes toward the target ridge and spoke so softly Ethan Cole almost thought he imagined it. "Wind on the ridge is lying." Briggs scoffed. "Steel is 1,100 yards. Full value crosswind 8 miles per hour. We have the data." Dean nodded once. "At the ridge, maybe." He lifted a weathered finger toward the basin below. "But halfway out, downdraft off that ravine is dragging low. Then thermal lift off those rocks carries it back. Your bullet is flying through 3 arguments before it ever reaches steel. A few Marines exchanged uncertain looks. They had spent all morning feeding variables into expensive solvers, and none had spoken of the valley itself as if it had a personality. Briggs stepped closer, voice edged with impatience. This is not folklore hour, old man. Either take the shot or admit that rifle belongs over a fireplace. Dean lowered himself to the mat with movements so measured they unsettled the young men watching. There was no rush, no performance. He settled behind the M40 and the whole range seemed to inhale. The walnut stock met his shoulder like it had been waiting decades for this moment. His hand drifted over the gouge near the bolt, and for a flicker of a second his gaze went somewhere far beyond Camp Pendleton. Ethan noticed it, so did no one else. Briggs crouched beside him, sarcasm curling at the edge of every word. Need help adjusting for modern gravity? Some of the Marines laughed, but weaker this time. Dean ignored him. He studied Mirage through the scope, then looked over it with naked eyes, reading brush movement halfway up the slope, dust devils along the wash, a lone hawk circling where warm air rose in invisible columns. He reached up and turned the old scope turret 2 quiet clicks. Ethan frowned. It did not match the correction Briggs had called. That is wrong, Briggs muttered. Dean answered without lifting his cheek from the stock. No, it is older. Then came something stranger. Dean lifted his finger from the trigger. Waited. 30 seconds. 40. No one moved. No one coughed. Even Briggs, full of contempt moments ago, had fallen silent under the weight of the old man's concentration. Ethan felt his own pulse pounding in his ears. The wind flag nearest the line snapped left. Another farther out sagged still. Dean whispered, almost to himself, "There!" The shot broke so clean it startled no one and everyone at once. It was not loud in memory, only precise. Recoil settled into his shoulder like ritual. Then came the longest second on Earth. No one breathed. No one blinked. Heat shimmer trembled over the canyon. And from 1,100 yards away came the distant metallic ring of impact, thin and bright as a church bell in desert air. For one impossible heartbeat, the entire range forgot how to speak. The steel echo had barely faded when disbelief broke across the firing line in whispers too stunned to become words. Marines who had spent all morning wrestling equations now stared at the old man as though the desert itself had bent for him. Gunnery Sergeant Briggs remained crouched beside the mat, jaw rigid, eyes fixed through his spotting scope as if he might force reality to change if he looked hard enough. But the target still swayed faintly from impact. There was no arguing with steel. Dean Mercer did not smile. He eased the rifle from his shoulder and looked back toward the ridgeline, not with pride but with the quiet attention of a man still listening to unfinished conversation. One of the younger Marines finally exhaled. Another muttered, "Lucky wind." The words hung there, thin and defensive. Briggs seized them at once, pride grasping for ground. One hit does not prove doctrine. His voice came harder now, sharpened by humiliation. Even a broken watch catches noon. He rose and pointed farther up the canyon where a second target stood half hidden near a shelf of pale rock, smaller, farther, nearly 1,400 yards. You want to impress this line, old man. Ring that one. Several Marines turned in disbelief. The challenge was absurd. Ethan Cole felt a chill despite the heat. Briggs was not testing skill anymore. He was trying to bury a miracle under impossible odds. Yet Dean simply looked at the distant target and gave the smallest nod, as if Briggs had suggested something reasonable. That one is easier, he said. A few nervous laughs escaped, but they died almost immediately. Briggs frowned. Easier. Dean pointed with one weathered finger. Ridge bends the wind cleaner there. He moved back behind the M40. But this time Ethan noticed something different. The old man's hand paused on the scar in the walnut stock and his eyes narrowed, not at the target, but inward. For an instant the present seemed to thin around him. The shimmering range, the Marines, the clipped radio chatter at the tower all receded beneath some older memory only he could hear. Ethan saw Dean's thumb trace the gouge as though reading braille left by time itself. "That mark," Ethan said quietly, almost without thinking. "How did it get there?" Dean did not answer at first. His voice came low, nearly lost in the wind. "Bad morning in a jungle nobody admits existed." Briggs pretended not to hear, but something in his posture had changed. The swagger was thinning. Dean settled into the rifle again. This time he made no turret correction at all. That unsettled Ethan even more. "No adjustment?" he whispered. Dean's pale eyes remained in the scope. "Already accounted for." The old Marine waited again, longer this time, studying the mirage boil, a shimmer sliding off sun-baked rock, dust lifting from the ravine floor. Then he did something none of the Marines expected. He shifted aim several inches off steel. Briggs saw it and almost barked protest, but stopped himself. The line had gone too silent for interruption. Dean breathed out halfway and held. The trigger broke. Recoil touched his shoulder and vanished. Once again time stretched thin. Heads tilted toward the canyon. A second passed. Then another. Then, from farther than seemed reasonable, came a sharper metallic note, lighter, almost musical, carrying back over the desert like struck silver. Someone behind Ethan whispered a prayer. Another Marine removed his cover without realizing he had done it. Briggs lowered his spotting scope slowly, as though the weight of it had doubled. He looked at Dean Mercer differently now, not as an old trespasser, not as a joke, but as a question he was no longer sure he wanted answered. No one moved after the second steel ring. It was as if the desert itself had paused to witness something older than competition. Even the wind flags, twitching moments ago in restless disagreement, now seemed part of a silence too heavy to disturb. Dean Mercer rose from the mat slowly, cradling the M40 with neither triumph nor ceremony, and for several long breaths no Marine spoke. Gunnery Sergeant Briggs stared toward the distant target shelf, then back at the old man, his face drained of the easy sarcasm that had carried him all morning. Pride had not vanished, but it had been forced to make room for doubt. Ethan Cole felt it too, that tightening sense that this was no longer a strange interruption on a training day, but the edge of a story too large for any of them. Briggs cleared his throat, though his voice came lower than before. "Who taught you to read wind like that?" Dean looked down at the rifle stock, thumb brushing the old gouge once more. "Men who did not waste shots." There was no boast in it, only memory. Ethan stepped closer, unable to stop himself. "That mark in the wood. It was not from age, was it?" This time Dean did not avoid the question. His eyes drifted past the firing line toward some vanished jungle hidden behind California sun. "Shrapnel kissed it in '68. The words landed with a weight no one laughed at. A younger Marine near the spotting scopes whispered, "'68. Another muttered, "That would make him," but did not finish. Briggs folded his arms again, though now it seemed less authority than defense. Stories are cheap, yet even he did not sound convinced. Dean gave a faint nod. "They are, which is why rifles remember better than men." Then something shifted. Ethan noticed a faded leather sling tag tied near the buttstock, brittle with age, stamped with letters almost worn smooth. He leaned closer. 3 characters. G1. His pulse stumbled. He had heard whispers in the armory, old stories traded by senior snipers over burnt coffee about a call sign no one used anymore. Ghost One. Myth, they had said. A man who could read air like scripture. Ethan looked up sharply at Dean, but before he could speak, static crackled from the range radio tower. A clipped voice broke over the speaker. "Range control to Alpha Line, hold all firing." "Repeat, hold all firing." Marines turned instinctively. Briggs frowned. "What now?" The radio hissed again, urgency beneath the professionalism. "Command convoy inbound to your sector." Murmurs spread. "Senior. Command never rolled onto a sniper qualification lane without cause." Dust rose far down the access road. Ethan squinted through heat shimmer and caught movement, dark vehicles cutting through the glare. Briggs followed his gaze, unease hardening his posture. "Who did you call?" he demanded, though no one answered. Ethan felt his stomach drop. Earlier, While Briggs had mocked the old man, Ethan had slipped a quiet text to Master Gunnery Sergeant Hale at the armory. Just a name and a question. Dean Mercer, M40. Possible Ghost 1. He had not expected an answer this fast. The convoy grew clearer. Black Suburbans. Lead escort. A staff jeep trailing. Marines along the line unconsciously straightened. Dean alone seemed unsurprised. He looked at the approaching dust plume as one might regard weather long predicted. Briggs stepped closer to him, voice almost reluctant. "Who are you?" Dean turned, pale blue eyes steady as winter sky. "Today," he said softly, "just an old Marine at the range." Then the distant chop of rotor blades rolled over the canyon, low and growing, and every head tilted upward. The rotor wash reached the range before the helicopter appeared, stirring dust devils across the gravel and tugging at range flags that moments before had been the only authority anyone trusted. Marines shielded their eyes as a dark utility helicopter swept over the ridge and banked low toward the service pad beyond the firing line. Its rhythmic thump rolled through the canyon like distant thunder, and with every passing second the impossible morning seemed to slip further from routine. Gunnery Sergeant Briggs stood rigid now, all trace of mockery burned off by uncertainty. Ethan Cole felt his throat tighten as black Suburbans halted in a line near the pad and doors opened in practice sequence. Men in dress khakis and command insignia stepped out first. Then one figure emerged that made even Briggs go still. Major General Russell Vance. 2 stars bright against desert light. The murmurs died before they fully formed. Nobody had summoned a general for a training lane dispute. Yet here he was, moving with unnerving speed for a man of rank. Not toward Briggs, not toward the line, but straight toward Dean Mercer. The old veteran remained where he stood, one hand resting lightly on the M40, expression unchanged. Ethan noticed something almost impossible then. As Vance approached within 10 paces, he slowed, then removed his cover. A hush spread through the Marines like cold water. Generals did not uncover outdoors in the field. Not casually. Not for anyone. Briggs's mouth parted slightly. Dean looked at him with faint recognition, almost weary affection. "Russ," he said, as though greeting a neighbor. General Vance stopped, eyes fixed on the old rifle. His voice, when it came, was roughened by something too deep to hide. "I told them you would still outshoot my best." Several Marines stared as though the earth had shifted under them. Briggs blinked once, twice, struggling to reconcile the man he had mocked with the general addressing him by first name. Then Vance's gaze dropped to the scar in the walnut stalk. He reached out but did not touch it. "Still carrying Da Nang with you?" At those words, something in Dean's pale eyes flickered. Not pride, memory. The desert air seemed to thin, and Ethan sensed what came next was not for spectacle but for history. Dean looked past the Marines toward the canyon as though seeing another landscape layered beneath it. "Monsoon had turned the ridge to mud," he said quietly. "Visibility gone. Wind wrong every second." Even Briggs leaned closer without realizing it. Dean's thumb traced the gouge. "Young lieutenant beside me thought the valley had us trapped." A faint smile ghosted at one corner of his mouth. "He talked too much." General Vance answered almost in a whisper. "And you saved the patrol with one shot through rain nobody believed could be read." Ethan felt his pulse hammer. He was hearing legend spoken in ordinary tones by the men who lived it. Dean glanced at him then, perhaps sensing the young Marine trying to hold the weight of it. "That gouge came when shrapnel clipped the stock after the shot. Nearly lost the rifle." Vance shook his head. "Nearly lost me." The words landed harder than any shouted revelation. Briggs looked as if struck silent by something larger than embarrassment. He had mocked not merely a veteran, but the man who had once saved a future general. Then, with no warning, General Vance stepped back and came to full attention. The movement was crisp, absolute. Every Marine on the line froze, and before any could comprehend it, the general raised a formal salute to the old man with the scarred M40. No one had ordered the range silent, but not a soul made a sound. General Russell Vance held the salute longer than protocol required, and in that impossible stillness something invisible shifted across the firing line. Marines who had arrived that morning, certain rank and technology explained the world, now stood before a different order of authority. One measured in memory, competence, and earned silence. Dean Mercer returned the salute with no flourish, only the old precision of emotion worn smooth by decades. When his hand lowered, no one moved. Even Gunnery Sergeant Briggs seemed pinned in place by the weight of what he had witnessed. Vance turned slowly to the assembled Marines, his gaze sweeping across the line until it settled on Briggs. There was no anger in it, which somehow made it harder to bear. Who challenged him to shoot? Briggs stepped forward instinctively, boots grinding gravel. I did, sir. The words came tight. Vance studied him for a long second, then gave a faint nod. Good. Confusion flickered through the line. Briggs himself looked struck by the answer. Vance continued, voice carrying with the quiet force only seasoned command possesses. Because arrogance that survives correction becomes rot. Arrogance corrected by truth becomes discipline. No one forgot those words. Ethan Cole felt them settle somewhere permanent. Vance turned back toward Dean and gestured toward the firing mat. Would you show them one more thing? Dean looked mildly amused. At my age, Russell, one miracle per morning ought to be enough. A few nervous smiles broke across stunned faces. But Vance's expression remained intent. Not a miracle. A lesson. Dean considered the canyon, then nodded once. He moved again to the line, but this time every Marine instinctively gave space. No one laughed at the old rifle now. No one called it relic or museum piece. Ethan noticed even Briggs stood slightly behind Dean, as though unwilling to presume equality with the firing mat. Dean set the M40 down and pointed not to the distant steel, but to the nearest Marine sniper rifle fitted with the newest optics and ballistic computer. Whose rifle? A young sergeant raised his hand. Dean motioned him closer. Lie down. The Marine obeyed. Dean crouched beside him, weathered finger tracing the valley through the scope. You all trust machines because machines speak in certainty. Wind never does. He tapped the stock lightly. Watch mirage before flags. Watch leaves before dust. Watch what moves where no one tells it to move. The line leaned in. Even senior officers near the convoy had drawn closer. Dean gave a firing correction no computer had offered that morning, then had the young sergeant send a round. The steel rang almost immediately. A murmur ran through the Marines. Dean had not merely proven skill. He had transferred it. Vance smiled faintly, the kind earned only by old ghosts revisiting old crafts. Briggs swallowed and stepped forward with visible effort. Sir. He was speaking to Dean now, not the general. I mocked your rifle. Dean looked at him, neither severe nor forgiving, only steady. Briggs continued, voice lower. I was wrong. For several heartbeats Dean said nothing. Then he held out the M40. Take it. Briggs hesitated as though offered a sacred object. He received the rifle in both hands, careful, almost reverent. His thumb brushed the scar in the walnut stock where he had once seen only damage. Now he seemed to feel history there. Dean watched him and said quietly, Wood remembers pressure. Men should too. Then from somewhere near the command vehicles, an old master gunnery sergeant who had arrived with the convoy spoke a name under his breath. Not meant for ceremony but heard all the same. Ghost One. The whisper moved through the Marines like electricity. And for the second time that day the entire range went still. The name lingered over the firing line long after it was spoken. Ghost One. Moving through the Marines not as rumor anymore but as recognition. Some had heard. Fragments in armory folklore, old sniper tales traded like campfire myths. None had believed the legend stood before them in worn denim, sunlight on silver hair, dust on his boots. Yet there he was, quiet as ever, while the weight of his presence seemed to grow simply because it asked for nothing. Gunnery Sergeant Briggs still held the M40 in both hands, almost afraid to shift his grip. The rifle that had drawn his laughter now carried the gravity of an artifact. Dean Mercer motioned for him to keep it. Balance point is farther forward than you expect. Briggs obeyed without question. Even his posture had changed. The hard angles of pride had softened into attention. General Vance watched the transformation with the faint look of a man seeing history repeat in a gentler form. "There is one thing left," he said. "Every legend carries a test nobody believes until they see it." Several Marines exchanged glances. Ethan felt anticipation tighten across the line. Dean gave Vance a look half weary, half amused. "You still tell that story?" Vance almost smiled. "I tell the part where no one believes it." He turned toward a weathered steel plate hung near the far canyon wall, smaller than the others, nearly lost against the stone. 1,800 yards. Murmurs stirred. Even modern rifles rarely trained there. Briggs looked from the target to the old M40 in his hands, then back to Dean. "No one makes that shot with iron araglass." Dean corrected him softly. "No one young does." A few Marines let out startled breaths that might have become laughter in any other hour, but reverence had replaced mockery now. Dean accepted the rifle back and moved once more to the mat. Yet this felt unlike the earlier shots. Not a contest. Not proof. Something ceremonial. Ethan noticed even the command staff had gone silent. Dress shoes beside combat boots in a line no rank separated. Dean settled behind the rifle and did not touch the trigger. He watched the canyon for a long while, longer than before, until some Marines shifted from the strain of waiting. Then he said, almost too softly to hear, "Wind changes every generation. Human nature does not." His finger brushed the scar in the stock. For an instant Ethan imagined the unseen jungle, the rain Vance had described, ghosts moving behind the old man's eyes. Then Dean inhaled, half released, and the shot broke. The sound vanished into open desert. This time the delay seemed endless. 5 seconds. 6. No one dared count aloud. Then, impossibly distant, came the faintest metallic note, so delicate several Marines looked to one another to confirm they had heard it at all. But the spotter scope passed quickly from hand to hand and each face returned transformed. The plate was swaying. No cheer rose. No one shouted. The silence after was too complete for noise. Briggs lowered his head. Not in shame now, but something close to respect bordering on awe. Without being told, one Marine came to attention. Then another. Then the entire line, as if moved by a single unseen command, snapped upright in sequence. Ethan followed, heart hammering. No order had been given. Yet every Marine stood at attention facing the old sniper on the mat. General Vance stepped beside Dean and spoke not loudly, but every man heard it. "Today you did not witness a trick of marksmanship." He looked down the line. "You witnessed memory outrun machinery." Then Briggs, voice rough with humility, asked the question none had yet dared. "Sir, why did you come here today?" Dean rose slowly, sunlight catching the scarred walnut stalk, and answered with the smallest hint of a smile. "To see if the Corps still listened when an old rifle spoke." Dean Mercer's answer settled over the range with the strange force of something simple and final. To see if the Corps still listened when an old rifle spoke. No one laughed. No one even shifted. The words seemed to hang in the desert air beside the last fading echo of steel. Gunnery Sergeant Briggs looked down at the gravel, then back at Dean, as though measuring himself against something he had only just discovered existed. General Vance studied the line of Marines standing rigid at attention and gave a faint approving nod. "Then perhaps," he said, "the Corps should answer." He turned toward the command vehicles where an elderly master gunnery sergeant stood waiting, silver-haired, broad-shouldered despite age, campaign ribbons bright against a weathered chest. Ethan heard someone whisper the name Hale. The old master guns stepped forward carrying a long wooden case. Even before it opened, a current of expectation moved through the line. Briggs frowned slightly, confused. Dean looked almost annoyed. "Russell," he muttered, "do not make a circus of this." Vance ignored him with practiced familiarity. The case opened. Inside rested a folded Marine Corps shooting jacket, dark green with faded leather shoulder patch, preserved with impossible care. Beside it lay a worn brass challenge coin and a weathered sniper qualification badge unlike any issued in decades. Hale lifted the coin first, holding it where sunlight struck old scratches across its face. "Ghost 1 qualification coin," he said quietly. "Discontinued in 1973. 1 issued." Murmurs rippled through the line. Ethan felt the skin along his arms rise. This was no longer rumor. It was lineage. Hale placed the coin in Briggs's hand. The gunnery sergeant stared at it as though it weighed pounds. This was carried by every sniper candidate who survived Mercer's mountain course. Hale glanced at Dean. Until he disappeared from records. Briggs looked up. Disappeared. Dean answered before Hale could. Some missions were meant to stay unwritten. Even Vance did not challenge that. Then came the part no one expected. General Vance faced the assembled Marines. "Gunnery Sergeant Briggs." "Sir." "Step forward." Briggs obeyed instantly. Vance pointed to the old shooting jacket. "Place it on him." Briggs froze. "On Mr. Mercer, sir." Vance's voice hardened, though not with anger. "On your senior Marine." Briggs swallowed and took the jacket with both hands. The same man who hours earlier mocked a scarred rifle now approached Dean with something almost reverent. He eased the old jacket over Dean's shoulders, adjusting it carefully. The faded leather settled against the field jacket as though returning home. No applause followed. Only silence so deep Ethan could hear flags snapping in the crosswind. Then Briggs did something no one instructed. He stepped back, came to attention, and rendered a salute. Dean regarded him a moment, then returned it. Something in Briggs's face loosened, as if an old hardness had finally broken. Vance turned to the Marines. "Every one of you carries new optics, new calculators, new doctrine. Good. Keep them. But remember this day, because skill without humility decays into vanity." His gaze swept the line. "And vanity misses." Several Marines lowered their eyes. Ethan did not. He watched Dean remove the old qualification badge from the case and, to everyone's shock, hold it out to him. "Lance Corporal." Ethan nearly forgot how to breathe. "Sir, you were the first to sense something was wrong." Dean placed the badge in his palm. "Guard curiosity. It sees farther than ego." Ethan's fingers trembled around the metal. Then from the ridge a gust rolled through, lifting dust, tugging jackets, stirring range flags in 3 directions once more. Dean looked toward them and smiled faintly. "There. Wind is arguing again." Even Briggs almost laughed. But before the sound fully formed, a bugler from the command convoy raised a horn and sounded colors across the canyon. Every Marine straightened instinctively, and in that haunting brass note drifting over sun-baked stone, the old sniper stood wrapped in forgotten green, while an entire generation of Marines looked at him not as legend anymore, but inheritance. The bugle's last note faded into the canyon and left behind a stillness no one wanted to disturb. For a long moment the only sounds were wind combing over sandstone and the faint rattle of range flags returning to their restless arguments. Yet nothing on that firing line felt the same as it had that morning. Marines who arrived trusting only rank tabs, optics, and hard certainty now stood in the presence of something older and harder to define. Dean Mercer slipped the faded shooting jacket from his shoulders and folded it with practiced care, returning it to the wooden case as though placing memory back where it belonged. He did not linger in ceremony. That, Ethan noticed, was perhaps the most extraordinary thing about him. After impossible shots, a general salute, a forgotten call sign spoken aloud, the old man seemed ready simply to leave. General Vance watched him with quiet understanding. "You always did vanish before anyone could make a monument of you." Dean gave a faint smile. "Monuments gather pigeons." A few Marines let out soft laughter, the first easy sound all day. Even Briggs smiled, though there was humility in it now. He stepped forward holding the M40 in both hands and offered it back. But before releasing it, he hesitated. "Sir, may I ask something?" Dean looked at him. "Go ahead, Gunny." Briggs swallowed once. "When you saw me mocking you this morning, why did you not put me in my place?" Dean rested a hand on the rifle stock, thumb touching the old scar. "Because a man learns more from being allowed to discover he is wrong than from being told." Briggs lowered his eyes, receiving it as one receives correction worth keeping. Then Dean turned unexpectedly to Ethan Cole. "Walk with me." The young lance corporal obeyed almost in disbelief as Dean moved slowly toward the edge of the range where scrub brush met the ridge trail. The others did not follow. Felt instinctively private. Sun had begun its long western drop, pouring amber light across the canyon where targets now glowed like small embers. Dean stopped near a weathered fence post and looked out over the valley. "You asked about the gouge." Ethan nodded. Dean tapped the rifle stock. "People think scars are damage. Often they are coordinates. They tell you where you survived." Ethan held the old qualification badge tighter in his palm. "Sir, were you really Ghost One?" Dean considered the question for a while, then shook his head almost gently. "Ghost One was a call sign. Call signs stay. Men fade." Ethan felt that settle deep. After a moment, Dean reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded paper, yellowed and worn thin. A wind chart sketched in pencil. Handwritten notes in cramped old script. He placed it in Ethan's hand. "Learn the valley before you trust the instrument." Ethan looked up stunned. "I cannot take this." "You can," Dean said, "because one day some young hotshot will think wisdom began with his generation. Hand him that." When they returned, the convoy was preparing to depart. Engines idled. Dust drifted. General Vance clasped Dean's forearm once, soldier to soldier. No grand farewell. No speech. Dean climbed into an old pickup no one had noticed parked near the maintenance sheds. Briggs stepped aside as the truck rolled past, then came sharply to attention and saluted. This time every Marine on the line followed without command. Dean paused only long enough to raise 2 fingers from the steering wheel, then drove slowly down the service road until heat shimmer swallowed truck and man together. Hours later, as sunset burned red over Camp Pendleton, Ethan remained alone at the firing line holding the old wind chart. He looked through his scope at the far ridge and for the first time noticed 3 currents moving where he once saw one. Behind him, Briggs approached quietly. "You see it now?" Ethan nodded. 3 winds. Briggs looked toward the road where the old pickup had vanished. "Funny." "What?" Ethan asked. Briggs answered without taking his eyes off the horizon. "This morning I thought he brought an old rifle to the range." He paused. "Turns out he brought the range back to life." And as evening winds stirred the flags once more, Ethan understood the lesson had never been about the shot. It had been about listening, because respect is not demanded by noise, and mastery does not announce itself. Some rifles carry more memory than metal, and some salutes last a lifetime.